Our next speaker is Stephen Raverty, who's a wonderful asset to not only our students here at UBC, but also to DFO, Vancouver Aquarium, and to many others, including many of our colleagues in the US.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Pamela, for the opportunity to present at this session. The focus of this talk is on our work on reviewing post-mortem findings of stranded killer whales from 2004 through to 2013. And obviously this would entail quite a multidisciplinary and multi-institutional effort. And I just wanted to acknowledge the people that we've been working with quite closely to try and compile and assimilate this data and then try and put it in context of what might actually be going on in some of these populations. We really value the opportunity to go out and conduct these necropsies. It really affords us a unique opportunity to understand some of the natural history of the animals. By doing post-mortem examinations, we can actually assess a specific cause of death. This is through our pathology training, but also look for diseases or disorders that may not necessarily contribute to death, but can impair health. And by that, I mean there are certain conditions that may impact the ability of these animals to successfully reproduce or to successfully forage, and many other factors. And these are increasingly our areas of particular interest to us as a community trying to investigate and understand some of the disorders in these animals. As well, you'll see in the study that what we've done is broken down individual findings by age class, and we find that this really helps us refine specific disorders or diseases in different age classed animals, so perinates or neonatal animals, calves, adults, and so on. Just some of the efforts that are currently underway in terms of nutritional condition, looking at infectious diseases. We're now trying to adapt some of the most advanced molecular sequencing and really collaborating with some of the preeminent laboratories, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. Over this 10-year span, we had 53 strandings, and just to put this in context, we've done a study previously looking at all stranded killer whales. Initially, our initial focus was worldwide to try and garner some understanding of population dynamics in different regions. We were able to recover or identify 242 strandings since 1940 through to 2000, about 10. And so that number has since increased. By dedicated funding through NOAA and Department of Fisheries and Oceans, we've actually increased our efforts to try and attend to these animals that do strand and have been able to conduct necropsies on 53 individual animals. And you'll see that only 27 of them we've identified as having a specific disorder or disease. In many instances, some of these animals can present with a fairly advanced autolysis. Some of them are just inaccessible. There are many things that may hinder our ability to actually conduct a very thorough and comprehensive necropsy. I should emphasize that this doesn't just focus in British Columbia, but actually we have animals that have been identified from Alaska right through to California and even in Hawaii. With the breakdown of number of strandings according to year, and this is again over a 10-year span, you can see that the highest number was in 2011, and this was due to 3 individuals in particular up in Alaska that had swum into a fairly deep river and subsequently died of, we believe, emaciation. It's sort of an extraliminal type of process. By categorizing the diseases, this further helps us to understand some of the mechanisms that might be involved. And these are just general categories. We would use these if we're looking at Vancouver Island marmots or any sort of animal. We just break them down into general disorders. So there's nutritional metabolic. This would include malnutrition, deficiencies, or toxicities, as well as metabolic disorders. We've identified even in entangled humpbacks where these animals are straining to the extent that their muscles are starting to deteriorate. They get a lactic acidosis and a variety of sequelae related to that. Trauma has been identified as human interaction as well as non-human interaction. Extraliminal, we would envision these as animals that are outside of their normal range. So again, going back to these 3 killer whales that were up in Alaska, they were in a freshwater river for 6 weeks, and then subsequently died, we believe, because of starvation. Congenital, degenerative, toxic, and undetermined. And unfortunately, the undetermined category is one that is our #1 conclusion, and this is largely derived by reviewing, each case is reviewed by 5 different pathologists, and you can imagine the expertise that's involved in reviewing this and the input that's sought. And ultimately, this is sort of the culmination of that effort. There were 6 animals in which we were able to find a conclusive diagnosis, and I should emphasize that we're even further trying to define these as the proximate and immediate causes of death. So proximate may be what may have set the animal up to a particular disease, whereas the immediate may be something that's supervening or secondary to that inciting cause. So in this calf mortality, you see that infectious disease. This one from Alaska was actually because it had ingested a fish hook and, oh, I'm sorry, I might have skipped a slide. Oh no, this is one where an animal had ingested a fish hook that impaled the pharynx or the back of the throat, subsequently resulted in a septicemia or bacteremia. The second animal on the list from California is quite interesting. This is a little neonate, offshore neonate, that was found stranded in Santa Barbara, and it turned out that it had Salmonella Newport septicemia. This is something we typically associate with terrestrial animals, poultry and cattle and so on. And the big question is, if an animal is that far offshore, how is it actually being exposed to this bacteria and then subsequently resulting in the death of this particular animal? What's a little bit more disconcerting is that it's very likely that infection was in utero, so the mom was probably exposed, the bacteria localized to the placenta and then was transmitted to the developing fetus. Mentioned the metabolic, and this is one that we're particularly interested in. These are animals, and this one in 2010 from BC was actually an animal that was recovered by Souk. And this little calf, we are able to take postmortem heart blood and submit that to a lab, and they can quantify the amount of immunoglobulin that's present. So that first suckle that a calf or a neonate takes is where the mom is transferring immunoglobulins to the little calf, and those are assimilated into the calf. And we actually have techniques of measuring that. And what we're finding increasingly is that that isn't occurring in some of these young calves. And so they're not getting that protective barrier, and they're also losing out on the nutrients in that first colostrum bolus. Moving on to the next age class, again, trauma is something that we weren't really appreciative of when we first started to look at this, but increasingly something that's becoming of concern, and trying to look at it from a forensic perspective, whether it's a primary cause of death or whether these animals may have other underlying diseases that are predisposing them to some sort of physical injury. And then the adult, this animal from 2004 with the mesosalpinx, these are essentially benign smooth muscle tumors within the reproductive tract. And what was interesting is that this animal was also culture positive for Brucella. And Brucella is a bacteria that historically has been found in dairy cattle and a variety of other species and can cause significant reproductive loss. The Brucella in these animals and killer whales is different to the one that we find in terrestrial species. But in fact, there have been case reports of the marine mammal Brucella infecting people, resulting in quite significant. And then you can see the spectrum of other disorders that have been identified, the metabolic, beach casting. And again, this would go back to an animal where if it's found on shore, you can imagine the weight of the animal is actually compressing the muscle. And as a consequence, the blood flow can't perfuse through those areas. You get a loss of oxygen, a buildup of lactic acid, and essentially the muscles become solubilized. So these are something that's of tremendous importance to us. And then this is just to round out the last of the group of animals. And again, you can see the undetermined is something that's quite significant in these particular cohort. What we need to do, or what would we need to do to enhance investigations in the future? And this is really drawing on a lot of the work by Mike Moore and Bill McClellan in the Northeast, with the Northern Right Whale effort. And their reports are actually immaculate. They're about 30 pages long, and they really try and tie in and integrate what's going on in the individual animal, the population, and the environment. And that's where I'm hoping that we can start to direct our efforts with a lot of the work that's being done with the killer whales. Faster response, and we're getting really good in terms of mobilizing and identifying people. It's really a team effort out there to try and attend these animals and do a necropsy. We're really interested in looking at some of these perinatal animals. It looks like the perinates or the neonates, very young animals, and then the very geriatric ones are the ones that are dying out in the population. And it would be nice to get a better handle on what's going on. We're still having some difficulty in terms of refining ages of these animals. So being able to discriminate between subadult and adult would also be of tremendous value. And again, quantifying evaluation of nutritional condition. And this may tie into the work that Lance and John Durbin are doing with the drones and trying to better quantify the nutritional status of the animals, and then also looking at the reproductive status as well. So our next steps are really of particular interest, looking at the clinical and postmortem findings in the context of contaminant loads. Mentioned earlier about this study that was published with Michelle Barbieri, University of California at Davis, the U.S. Navy, NOAA, DFO, and ourselves, where we were able to look at 242 strandings, and you can see they're mapped out on the map on the right. We'd like to actually go back and look specifically at the distribution and findings of the southern resident killer whales to better understand what might be going on in the current population, and then again looking at these environmental factors much more closely. So again, a lot of this effort wouldn't be available, or we wouldn't be afforded the opportunities to go out without the assistance of DFO and NOAA, then there's staff here at the university, Animal Health Center, CDOC Society, as well as many of you who are out in the field and reporting these to the Marine Mammal Response Program, and then a list of collaborators. Thank you very much.